Biblical Psychology, the channel that combines psychological ideas with scripture to help you respond more effectively to the promises in the Bible with regards to mental health. And if this is the first time that you're joining us, you'll be very welcome to watch some of our previous episodes, particularly the first one that talks about the vision behind the channel. So today we're going to be looking at another taboo subject entitled domestic violence. And we're just going to spend a little time just exploring what this is. Then we're going to have a look at what the biblical perspective is on violence, and then we're going to look at the psychological evidence that supports that there is a strong link between domestic violence and mental ill health. And finally, we're going to be looking at some different levels of intervention that can be utilized to try to break the vicious cycle of domestic violence that occurs in our society. So just beginning with, well, what is domestic violence? And quite simply, it's defined as a range of abuse against an individual, and that might include physical, emotional, economical and sexual abuse. And it can be, victims can be children, adults and the elderly. And there's a model called the Power and Control Wheel, which was developed by Nashville Coalition Against Domestic Violence, that breaks down the different types of domestic violence that can occur. And you'll see the model come up on your screen, and we're just going to take a look at some of those. And there are 8 segments, and the first is coercion or threats, and that might include making or carrying out threats to do something to hurt someone, threatening to leave or make a false accusation against the person or police. You can have intimidation as another form of abuse, and that's been defined as making someone afraid of by using threats, looks, gestures, destroying property, abusing pets or wielding weapons. Then you've got the emotional abuse, putting someone down or humiliating them, playing head games, not taking responsibility for their actions. You have isolation, so someone who utilizes this kind of abuse might try to control what someone does, or they seek and talk to someone and uses unreasonable jealousy to try and get their way and to accuse someone of actions that they might not have even done. And then you've got denying, minimizing and blame. And this is about making fun of the abuse and saying it didn't happen, and just kind of undermining a person's emotional reaction to the abuse that they're experiencing. And then you've got using children, and so using children as a way to get back at a partner and accusing them of not looking after the children properly when they could be, etc. And then you've got economic abuse, and that's preventing someone from getting a job or demanding that someone works longer hours, and particularly say a partner who's dependent on their partner for income, and the partner who's the breadwinner can use this as a source of manipulation to get their way with that person. And then there's another category called gender privilege, which is treating the partner like a servant, acting like the king or the queen of the castle, and being the one to define that their partner's existence. And you just got a sense of how, you know, horrible and how diminishing being it can be if one is a recipient of these kinds of abuse. So I'm just going to have a look at the scripture and see what the scripture says about violence. And I have to say that the Bible largely does not advocate for a violent approach in relationships. And I'll just take you through some of the examples. So the first is Colossians 3 verse 19, which says, "Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them." So that's simple instructions to a married couple. And if we look at 2 Timothy 3 verse 1 to 8, it says, "But understand this, that in the last days there will come times of difficulty, for people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasable, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not loving good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having the appearance of godliness but denying its power. Avoid such people." So in that passage, it's basically prophesying how life will become. And if we look around us, I think many people will agree that our society is very much reflected in what those scriptures are saying. And if we look at 1 Peter 3 verse 7, it states, "Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered." And that's really interesting, because what's that's actually saying is that if a husband, particularly one who might be adopting a biblical worldview, considers abusing their wives, that they risk that their relationship with God being compromised. And if we look at James 1 19 to 20, it states, "Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. For the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God." So again, that verse is actually discouraging the expression of anger. And it's actually, I think, making a distinction between the anger of man and the anger of God. And the Bible talks about God's anger, and God's anger is a just anger, and God is angry when mankind does not adhere to the laws that he has set for man's own well-being and protection. And when we stray from that, then we become vulnerable to, we become at risk of experiencing the negative consequences associated with disobedience. So in summary, what the Bible is saying is that there are negative consequences associated with abusive relationships, and we are exalted not to engage in those types of behavioral expressions. And it's not surprising, that the Bible warns against executing violence and abuse, because the psychological evidence suggests that domestic violence has detrimental psychological consequences to its victim, particularly the victim, but also, I would say, to the perpetrator as well. So we're going to start with Polychronopoulou and Plazola Castano. And so in their study, they found that domestic abuse has severe psychological consequences for both women and children, with battered women often experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and reduced physical and mental health. Maker in 1998 found that children who witness parental violence in childhood experience long-term psychological issues, including depression and trauma symptoms. And Polychronopoulou and Douzenis in 2016 found in their study co-occurring psychological consequences in victims of domestic abuse as a result of being mistreated. They found that 60% of the domestic abuse victims presented with post-traumatic stress disorder, 46% presented with chronic post-traumatic stress disorder, and 40% declared that they felt worse than usual in the past 2 weeks. Rodriguez in 2016 found that domestic abuse compromises the development of a person as it produces emotional difficulties, insecure attachment styles, and depression, which ultimately lead to an increased risk to more abuse and an ability to infiltrate comfortably in the world. And I, for example, some of the work that I do in my own work is to assess psychological injuries sustained to children in domestically abusive families, and quite rightly so, because it would be a cause for concern if children do come from homes where they witness domestic violence. And Barahal in 1981 found that abused children show lower intelligence, delayed language development, and abnormal behavioural profiles. The social cognitive development of these children is also impacted, leading to differences in perceived locus of control and social role comprehensions. And Helfrichs in 2006 found that domestic abuse significantly impacts a person's abilities, particularly in the context of employment skills. And Danis and Agarwal found that self-efficacy and freedom from violence are also two factors that can be negatively impacted by domestic violence. And Corvo in 2014 found that domestic abuse can also lead to executive function deficits, and so that's talking about brain damage actually. And also Gutman in 2004 also found cognitive impairments in people who suffer domestic violence, and Ramiro and Martinez in 2013 also found neuropsychological deficits. So domestic violence, based on all those studies, has detrimental psychological difficulties, including emotional difficulties and neuropsychological ones as well. And there's been some opinions around what keeps people locked into this vicious cycle of violence. And I'm just going to take you through this diagram here, which will come up on the screen. Cycle of violence is the name of the diagram. And what this suggests is that a person who's violated or abused ends up staying in a relationship because it could be that the perpetrator expresses some apparent remorse and will try to compensate for their abusive behavior by becoming extremely kind and affectionate towards the person, that might ask them for their forgiveness, etc. So the person then gives in to this behavior and forgives the person, but then it doesn't stop there, because there'll be another time when the perpetrator is triggered and seeks to be abusive again, and this vicious cycle keeps the person locked in. And the way to break that vicious cycle is, first of all, acknowledge that no one deserves to be abused, and that if it even happens once, it would be prudent for the person to do something about that. And first of all, you need to be aware that domestic violence is a criminal offence, and anyone who experiences this has every right to call the police or to treat it as a crime. And that would be one intervention to try to break the vicious cycle. And this is an example of a traumatic incident that anybody can experience, and often people who have been victims of domestic violence will suffer with psychological symptoms such as post-traumatic stress disorder. And if a person has experienced a psychological reaction, then they would need to seek appropriate psychological treatment to help them to recover from this. And attend your GP would be an example of where you might be able to obtain appropriate psychological treatment. And also, I think being a victim of domestic violence can leave women experiencing very low self-worth and low self-esteem. And I think the message is that no person, for example women, deserve to be abused in this way. And it might be that there are charitable groups that focus on this particular issue to support women, or even men who've been, some men have reported being abused too, to be empowered not to accept this kind of dynamic in any relationship. So that's all I would like to say today on domestic violence, and I hope that there was some nugget of information that you could glean to help you on your journey of freeing yourself from a domestically violent lifestyle. So next week we're going to be looking at the psychological effects of being exposed to wars. And don't forget to subscribe, because that way you'll be notified of all the future episodes. Bye bye.